Just about 30 seconds, everybody. Okay, cool. Hi there, guys. Monica, Eric, Eileen, Samantha. Welcome, everybody. Alondra, hey. Okay, so it's now 11:10. So I'm just going to get us slowly underway here. First of all, thanks everybody for attending today, and I hope y'all had a really good Thanksgiving holiday and some good time to just rest, recharge, and spend a little time with your family or friends. But here we are, and it's good to be back. Now we've got just a couple of more weeks of our semester, kind of a quick sprint to the finish, really, as we get everything out of the way. I just wanted to kind of mention to you guys all some key important dates and info about the remaining part of our schedule here in the class. So just really briefly, I'm opening a window on my laptop here to look at the schedule. Okay, so today is Tuesday the 30th of November. Nice, Kylie, good to see you. Mike, Brian, everybody else that's here, welcome. So yeah, like this week we have 2 lectures basically, and then also one on the following Tuesday. So we have 3 more meetings where we're just going to be talking about stuff from the book, and it's all about chapter 9 really, these last 3 lectures. Then we will have 2 review sessions where we'll go over all the course material again, and so we've set aside 2 full periods to do that. And then there's the final exam on the 16th. Another question that I had for some of you guys is this question. And yeah, to the YouTube group, welcome back too. So did some of you guys notice the announcement that I mailed out yesterday about the 4th homework? Let me know if anybody got that one. Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, I'm just making sure my speaker is on in case anyone ever uses the mic. Cool, so you've got that notification. It's in the announcements tab of our Canvas page. And it is the 4th and the last homework. So we're down to 2 things. You just have the 4th homework and the final exam. All the other things have been submitted, and I'm still finishing the scoring of your most recent quiz and the 3rd homework. But those will be ready this week before the weekend is over with. So you'll have grades ready for you to check on for those 2 assignments coming up soon. Other than that, let me just tell you a few things about that 4th homework assignment. As I guess you probably saw if you looked at the instructions, it's about critical analysis of news media reports. So you basically just have to identify and watch some kind of 30-minute television news broadcast. If the show is longer than 30 minutes, like it's a sorry, if it's a 1-hour viewing schedule on the TV channel, you're only responsible for watching 30 minutes of it. So what you got to do is find some news program on TV to watch and sit down and watch it for 30 minutes. And then you're going to basically take good notes and watch carefully because you're going to try to find areas for critical comment. So you're going to try your best to find things such as fallacies, rhetoric, manipulative editing tactics, and so on, bias, whatever the case may be, to form some type of criticisms of the quality and content. Now, Jeannie, you have a good question, which is, can it be something recent or can it be something older, or does it have to be recent? What I intended is that it be something recent because, news is only news when it's new. So best case scenario, yeah, you're going to find something that's recent. I mean, if it's like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I guess that's fine. But my ideal for you would be to find some kind of current broadcast that's reporting on the news today. So if you went back into the archives and you watched like news from 10 years ago, it's not terrible, but it's not exactly the thing that I was hoping for. So try your best to watch a current news broadcast. There's 2 basic documents that you have to submit with this assignment. You can bundle them together as one, but there's 2 distinct things. So you have to create an itemized list of all the stories that were reported on within the viewing window of the 30 minutes that you chose, the show that you chose. So you also have to keep a time measurement device like a stopwatch or an app that just has a stop clock, and you're going to keep count of the exact amount of time in minutes and seconds that each story is given in the broadcast. So like one part of your assignment is just going to be sort of like a table of contents where it's going to show us a list of each story that was reported on, like just a brief little one sentence. Here's the nature of the story. Um, President, establishes new vaccine mandates for small businesses. Another story. Lakers, LeBron James is, you know, hit with a fine for altercation on the court. Whatever the case is, weather, sports, all the different stories that are included within the 30-minute window, you just have to create a list of them in the order that they were reported on. And next to that, you have to give the time signature, the amount of time exactly that was given to those. That can also be something that you refer to in your written report on the quality and content of the overall broadcast, because, for example, you might notice that more time is being given by the network to stories that have less importance. And that's actually something that's true. Studies show that more time is often given to like celebrity gossip, sports, and entertainment than real big issues of policy or international affairs or law or whatever the case is. So create the itemized list. Also include in that list a few pieces of basic identification. Like, so tell me the name of the show. So like Anderson Cooper, Tucker Carlson, whatever the case is, you'll give me the name of the show. You'll also tell me the name of the network that it was broadcast on, and you give me the time and date that it was aired originally. So this could be local news, it could be just Channel 4, 7, 9, ABC News at 8, stuff like that. It could be cable news, like some of the more partisan cable news networks. You can also use those as your option. The thing is, you're trying to find criticisms. So a successful assignment will be one where you're able to at least form some type of rational critique of either the content or quality of the news report. If you just say, it was a great report, seemed all factual, nothing was wrong, I mean, it's not exactly like you're displaying the tools of critical thinking that you've learned throughout the semester. So this is kind of like a capstone writing assignment where you get your best chance to display all the different concepts that you've learned through the semester in the report. I would say an easy way to do it is to pick one of the more biased or politicized news sources and use that as the source of critique. But you can also, of course, do it with any news broadcast as long as you're able to find those points of criticism. Here's something else. I want you to make sure that it's not a news show that's like a special feature that's dedicated to just one topic. So like we're doing a 60-minute deep dive into the politics of COVID-19, and that's just one story though. So I wanted it to be like a traditional news hour where there's a variety of stories that are given. And that's part of the reason that I'm asking you to report on the times allotted to each news item. If it was just one or two stories, there would be no point to the timekeeping. So try your best to have an authentic news broadcast where there's a number of different topics that they discuss within the viewing time given. If you're watching a 30-minute news broadcast, I'm talking about 30 minutes, including commercials and advertisements. So don't worry if it's like 21 minutes of content and then 9 minutes of, commercials and such. That's okay. The other thing is it's not supposed to be something that's based on satirical or comedic presentations of news, even though sometimes there are good pieces of factual information in shows like, I don't know, The Daily Show or Tonight with John Oliver, stuff like that. They're using humor to try and present the info, so I don't want it to be that. I'd rather it be a real, genuine, straight up news broadcast. So anyway, that's the nature of that assignment, and the way that it is assigned to you, it's due Thursday of the next week. So I guess that's Thursday the 9th. Make sure I'm giving you the facts here. Yes, it's due Thursday the 9th, anytime before midnight on that day. So, as late as 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, December 9th. Anytime prior to that, you'll just send me an email with your attached file. And then that'll be your fourth homework. It's worth 100 points. And besides that, we only have one other thing left over, and that's the final exam. So Any questions about that for now while we're here all together? I just wanted to have a chance to speak with you guys about it while we're in the live meeting. Um, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them, but if not, then we can just move into the notes for today on ethics. So are we good to go, or let me know if there's anything I can add to that? I think I tried to provide all the basic details. Okay, Eric, for the commercial within the 30-minute broadcast, do we have to give a specific time for them as well? Good question. Thank you, Eric. So no, you don't have to keep any record of the commercials or what the commercials were or how long they were. We're just focused and worried here about the content of the broadcast itself. Although, as we know, and as we've learned from our previous work, many times commercials contain misleading arguments, rhetoric, fallacies, and on all that. But now we're focused just on the broadcast content itself. So never mind the commercials, just to pretend like they don't exist, and you're just evaluating however much content was given within a 30-minute bracket of time. Okay, thank you. Let me say this. I think this is something that has come up in the past, even though none of you have asked about it yet. But sometimes in this modern day that we are in, I've noticed that students don't always have television subscriptions. I mean, it's not like you have to have cable per se, but if you have no TV at all and you just don't watch TV, and a lot of people now just use the internet and use their computers or phones, you still have to complete the assignment. Now, ideally, I would like it to be a TV news broadcast, but if you have absolutely no access to such, then as a substitute, you could use a re-uploaded version of a TV show that's been put onto, say, a YouTube channel of the news broadcaster. But it still has to obey all the other requirements. It has to be something that was ideally originally broadcast as a TV program, and then is just given as an online file that people can view there as well. And it should still be like a news show with a variety of topics, something current, something that's not old. So as a option for those that have no way of getting to a TV or to watch a TV news hour, you could do that. So this is a good chance for us to become a little more critical about the content and quality of news broadcasts. Is there anything that's being done to shape the view of the audience or the individual watching it? In some cases, the news and information may be fair and reasonable, but we're going to try to sift through the good and bad and write a report. Now, the report itself that you write, which is separate from the itemized sort of table of contents with the time signatures, that can be like, say, 2 pages or 1 to 2 pages of 12-point font, double-spaced writing. So you've got a small short report, 2 pages or so, maybe a little less. Or if you really needed more space, that'd be fine as well. But roughly 2 pages, and then you have the separate document, which just contains the list of stories and the time, nature of the story, the broadcast, name, the title of the TV show, and the channel and date and time that it aired. Okay, and so there you go. If you have other questions about that one as you're working on it, just feel free to email me anytime or contact me in any other way, whether it's office hours or just during class meetings, and we can go over it again. But now you have that assignment given to you, so you work on that. Maybe don't wait to the absolute last minute because you don't want to put yourself under too much time pressure. But you have a great leisurely amount of time over the weekend and in the next 9 days to just take care of that. Okay, so I think we're good to go on that. That means that we're going to now just get back into our notes. We have one more chapter to cover. We covered a lot of material so far. So we started the class talking about the basics of logic and argument. What is an inductive, deductive argument? What's validity, soundness? What are different forms of deductively valid argument? We talked about the value of being a good critical thinker, what some of the benefits of it are, what are some of the obstacles and barriers to it. We talked about some of the famous social psychology experiments. So that was all from chapter like 8 and 1 for the most part. Then we spent some time looking at, I believe it was chapter 3, which talked about language and communication, effective communication, types of definitions, functions of language, rhetorical devices, stuff like that. Then chapter 4 was all about knowledge and the limits of human knowledge. What does it take to have knowledge? What is evidence? What are some cognitive errors that we sometimes commit when we try to form judgments? Let's see, criteria for justified true beliefs, sources of evidence, what are some unreliable sources of evidence, things like that. And then in chapter 5, as we know, we talked all about fallacies. logical flawed arguments, what are different types of fallacies, how we can see them in writing, in media reports, and all the rest. And then I guess we spent some time just talking about science. We also talked a little about the media in the middle of all that, media criticism and analysis, and the history of mainstream media in the West. And then, yeah, science was most recent. Science, talking about the history of science, what are some of the basic assumptions of science, what is the steps of the scientific method, and cool stuff like that. So now we've come to the end, and we have just this last chapter, and what it is chapter 9. And the topic of chapter 9 is ethics. Okay, so chapter 9, we're talking all about ethics, and that's going to be our focus now. By the way, I guess it's a good enough time, no time like the present. If you feel like leaving behind a comment to just keep your attendance recorded, go ahead and do so. Anytime, if you've already left a comment, that's fine. If not, just drop something in either chat, and that'll keep us all on the same page with your attendance. Okay, so hopefully you heard me there. Okay, so chapter 9, ethics. Hey, Chase. Well, ethics is another important topic for everyday life, for philosophy, and of course for critical thinkers like us. So what does the word ethics refer to? Do any of you guys have any sense of that? If I asked you, so suppose that you have like a curious, intelligent, younger sibling, 12 years old, and they say, I heard a weird word in school today. Can you tell me what it means? You're the adult now. They're asking you, and they say, what is ethics? Can you tell this person what it is, or even give them some idea? Anything at all you can throw out there for me? What is ethics? What do you talk about when you're talking about ethics? If you have no idea, fair enough. Just let me know. I have no idea. But if you have something, then let's see it. Okay, good, Brian. Moral beliefs. Lisa deals with what's right and wrong. Also very good. Yes, now it's taking shape. That is what ethics is about. And so academically, we could call it the study of morality and moral concepts. So that's what it is. Okay, ethics, the study of morality and moral concepts. So that's a large part of human life, talking about what we think is moral, what we think is right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. So I just want to kind of take this slow because there's so much that can be said about ethics. I think the first thing that we can do is just refer to some important basic concepts within ethics. So ethics has been studied for a long time, academically, in religion, in law. And there are 3 major types of actions that exist in discussions of ethics. So 3 main types of action in ethics. And so 3 main types of action in ethics. And all of us, whether we're studying it in school or just living our lives, we deal with ethical questions, right? Like you might be wondering, is somebody doing something wrong if they steal something to, I don't know, feed their family? Or you receive moral criticism or maybe praise. Somebody says, you did a very nice thing by donating blood or working at the food bank for the homeless. Or maybe somebody criticizes you, says, you really shouldn't have cheated on your partner, or it was wrong for you to lie about your sickness to your professor when you wanted an extension. So there's ethical questions that we face. And sometimes these questions also bleed into like legal questions. Of course, you could be held accountable for violations of law, which are in many cases also violations of ethics, but we'll talk about the difference between law and ethics as well. So I'm just trying to start this discussion off by giving you a sense of the big, broad topic of ethics and how it's really saturated through all of our lives. We are all of us capable of making moral judgments. Sometimes we see things happening in open society and we think that's terrible. Or in other cases, we say, that's right and just. And of course, sometimes we are the subject matter of other people's moral and ethical judgments, whether they be positive or negative. So we cannot escape the moral questions that face us as human beings. In a way, it's a unique thing that human beings can only question or discuss. unlike the lower animals. So 3 main types of actions in ethics, everyone. Here we go. The first are actions that are called morally impermissible. Okay. Morally impermissible. Okay. And then another type, which is like the reverse, would be those that are morally permissible. And then a third possible type of action in ethics is those that they call or deem morally obligatory. Okay, so we see these 3 terms and concepts: morally impermissible, morally permissible, morally obligatory. We're going to dive into those in just a second here, but I wanted to sort of, I guess, touch base with you to ask some of you guys questions about this. Can anybody tell me what you think are some different moral concepts? What are some words that express moral ideas or moral judgments? So sometimes we look at behavior and we can classify it on 2 different moral sides of the spectrum. We could say that it was either what or what. Can anybody give me a sense of this? Kind of like polarized opposites. All right, Jeannie, right. And what is the natural contrary of wrong? Right, there you go. Sorry, I say right and wrong. So right and wrong, that's good. That's one moral distinction, the difference between actions that we say are right or, on the other hand, wrong morally. Let's do more. There's more to this. So, Jeannie, that's great. Can anybody else or anyone at all add some further examples? So, good or bad. There you go, Jacob. Right, good and bad. Sometimes we look at behavior, policies, etc., and we make judgments of them. We say this is a good thing, or no, this is a bad thing. So that's a moral judgment too. Right, wrong, good, bad. What else? I've got a few others. Justified and unjustified. That's fair enough, Lisa. Although it's possible to have justification which is not moral in nature, but rather just epistemic. So like I can be justified right now in believing that I'm talking to you because you're typing these questions back to me. But that's not moral justification. Rather, that's just rational justification. Nonetheless, I do take your point, right? Sometimes we say that a person's action was not morally justified or that they did have a good moral reason to do it. Fair enough. So you guys are getting the sort of vibe here of the type of words I'm asking you for: right, wrong, good, bad, just and unjust. That's another one maybe that I could have mentioned just now when you said that, Lisa, just and unjust, instead of justified, unjustified. Sometimes we say of an act that it was just, and sometimes we say no, it was unjust for that action to take place. Can anybody help me with a few more? Has anyone ever heard the word moral? What's the opposite of that? Moral versus, so you have right versus wrong, good versus bad, moral versus immoral. There you go, Lisa and Brian, right. Let's see, anything else that's sort of in that realm that anybody can come up with? This is already, I think, a fair rundown, but I just kind of wanted to stimulate your thought further by adding some terms to this discussion about, moral concepts that we often use in our language. So right and wrong, good or bad, just or unjust, moral or immoral. And in general, since it's a lot of times about how we should act or how we shouldn't act, we can add that too. How one ought versus ought not to act. Okay. And then in the YouTube chat, let me just add some of these. Okay, but let us return to the above distinctions that we just had listed before. You see those still: morally impermissible, morally permissible, and morally obligatory. So let's go ahead and discuss the first of those 3, morally impermissible actions. What do you think it means, in other words, to say that an action is morally impermissible? That means that it's what kind of act, or what can you say to give a more full statement of what that means? If it's morally impermissible, this just means, in other words, that it's what? A morally impermissible act. No guesses? Let's hear it. You can at least do a guess. There you go, exactly, Lisa, that it's wrong, that it's morally wrong, and it's therefore not okay to do. So let me add that clear definition to the chat. So morally impermissible. These are actions that are wrong, and they are not okay to do. Maybe to put it a little less formally, they're just not okay to do. Morally impermissible actions. Okay. Now, morally impermissible actions doesn't mean that they're like physically impossible. Unfortunately, people can do them, but morally they shouldn't do them. They are not permitted, as the word indicates, by the rules of morality, whatever they may be. So these are bad things that people shouldn't be doing, and obviously, you guys know that there are some things that are wrong that people nonetheless do. Can anybody think of maybe some easy examples of morally impermissible conduct? Behavior that is not okay to do, it's wrong. Okay, rape, that's a clear example, John. I think we can all 100% agree that there's no morally acceptable case of rape. Theft, another good example, Jessica. Yes, they say that to steal is wrong, and it generally is because it's not your property and people have property rights. Of course, and I just want to make a few points as we go through your examples. Sometimes, a person might try to make a convoluted case that in some individual cases, perhaps theft could be morally justified. Maybe if it was done for a noble reason, like you're stealing from the rich to give to the poor. I'm not saying I believe in that, like Robin Hood or whatever. Or maybe somebody steals to feed their starving child or something. But at any rate, for the most part, with some possible exceptions, we would say yes, the vast majority of cases of theft would have to be wrong. Murder, that's another very clear one there, Jeannie. Yeah, murder, killing of an innocent person without due cause. Their life, they have a right to live, and so it's certainly not your moral permission to take it away. Not to worry. Thanks, Michael. Good to see you here. We're just going over examples of behaviors or actions that would be called morally impermissible. So 3 big ones already: rape, theft, murder. That's not all. Can anybody else think of bad things that you shouldn't be doing? Those are definitely some of the worst. Cheating, sure. So cheating in all kinds of different cases. Kidnapping, another one. False imprisonment of a person when you don't have the legal authority to do that. Cheating, whether it's in a relationship, maybe financial fraud, perhaps academic dishonesty. Lying just overall, right? Telling things that are false. Once again, though, it's possible to conceive of isolated examples of lying that are perhaps to some people's judgment not wrong. Like, what if somebody asked you, how do you think I look today? And you really think they don't look great, but you don't want to say the truth because that will hurt their feelings. Or they made you a meal and they asked you, how do you like it? And you thought it was really gross, but you don't want to make them feel bad. So you say, oh, it was really nice. Perhaps there could be these little white lies. But in general, we think of lying as a moral misdeed, and it's the exception rather than the rule that you should be lying. Abuse, yes, physical harm on other people for invalid reasons, not for reasons of self-defense or protection of important values. So good. I think you guys are all pretty clear on this point then. Morally impermissible behavior are actions that are wrong from some standpoint of morality, and we'll develop, what different theories of morality there are. But yes, they're thought to be wrong actions that are not okay to do. And so you've said rape, theft, murder, kidnapping, cheating, abuse, perhaps lying sometimes, and there's even worse things: genocide, religious persecution, and on and on and on. So, okay, there we go. Those are one class of actions, but it's fortunately not the whole thing. There's also the opposite, which are morally permissible actions. So we say morally impermissible acts are acts that are wrong and they're not okay morally to do. So if that's the definition of morally impermissible acts, what do you think a morally permissible act would be? It would be something that's on the opposite side of this description. So if impermissible are things that are wrong and they're not okay, then what is a permissible act morally? Morally permissible. They're actions that are okay to do, right? And Jacob, you say good. And I can see why you would think that, because perhaps good or right is like the natural contrary of the word wrong. But I would only add one slight, perhaps, little qualification on that. Because when people say the word right or good, they sometimes think of actions that, involve some kind of noble act of self-sacrifice to benefit other people, like, I don't know, donating money to a charitable organization or helping an old lady cross the street or something. And yes, those are morally permissible for sure. But it's not limited to those highly noble and valiant acts. It's also all the little daily things that don't necessarily create any major benefits for anybody, but they're also not wrong to do in and of themselves. So the way I would put it is just as follows. Morally permissible acts are acts that are not wrong, and they are okay to do. Okay, so yeah, no problem. Thank you. So, like in terms of what I was just saying, Jacob, and everyone else, yes, like um, donating time at the homeless shelter, distributing meals on Thanksgiving, that's morally permissible, but so is chewing gum, because chewing gum is not wrong to do. It doesn't victimize or harm anybody. So it's within your moral set of permissions. You're permitted morally to do that. You're not doing anything wrong. And now, of course, it's not saving the world. It's not, saving a person's life or making anyone's life better per se, but it's not wrong either. So it encompasses a big, wide class of things, all the things that are not wrong. So I've had the vibe that this class is a lot of pretty good moral people. And so I would hope that you have no difficulty at all giving me a bundle of examples of morally permitted acts, because you can just pick and choose from the things that you're mostly doing, because I assume you don't do a lot of bad things, even though all of us can occasionally act that way. So, okay, you're giving examples now. Donating to charity, good. Volunteering, that's another fair example. John, what are some other morally permissible actions? Morally permissible, you've given two. They're definitely fine. Going to school, yes. There's nothing evil or immoral about going to school. So, you've done nothing wrong today, at least in this case of coming to the class. Um, any other random stuff anyone wants to throw out there? I mean, it's like an infinite number of options. Doing your homework, okay, we're going back into like the academic stuff, sure. Yeah, and all kinds of other things. Flying a kite, going for a walk, riding a bike. As long as it's not a stolen bike or kite, going to the gym, sure. Okay, good. You guys seem to have the right ideas here. So we've divided up the terrain into two things. First of all, morally impermissible, those are wrong things. They're not okay to do. And then you have the morally permitted acts, which are not wrong and they are okay to do. Now that brings us to the third. What could be the concept of morally obligatory actions? And, the word kind of gives you a hint. You're just thinking about language and what the words mean in that. So morally obligatory actions, what would you guess that definition is? What kind of actions are those? If they're like over and beyond just being permitted. We're saying they're obligatory now. So that means what about it? Something that you're morally obligated to do, correct, Rory? So it would be something that you must do. It's like morally required or mandatory rather than optional. So acts that you must do morally, it would actually be, like wrong not to do them. We'll get to the examples in a moment there, Kylie and Jessica, but give me just a moment as I type this out. So morally obligatory acts that are that you must do, and it would be wrong not to do. Okay. So let's think of examples. Now I see already, Kylie and Jessica, you've thrown out a few possibilities, but let's go into them and see if they're valid. So you've said go into a family gathering, and I mean, I don't know, is it really morally obligatory? We have to think of all the possible universe of examples that could fit within. So, like, suppose that somebody has a family, but the family is abusive and harmful to this individual. So they've kind of disowned their family. You might say that in that case, there is no moral obligation to attend family events because this family is dysfunctional and abusive to the one person. So, like, I know what you meant. Like, oh, in a normal circumstance where you have like a happy, supportive family, going to a family gathering should be expected of you. But I don't know if it's a strict moral obligation in all conceivable cases. And so that's the reason why, a philosopher being very picky is going to have to be able to find no exceptions to the case. Now, Jessica, you say paying taxes, and I would generally agree with you. We need to fund public programs and services through the appropriation of tax revenue from the citizens, yes, and we all benefit from, the existence of roads, military protection, and et cetera. But you do know, right, that there are people out there like hardcore libertarians and stuff that would say, I don't even believe that there should be a state. We should just be able to like fend for ourselves and, don't tread on me. I don't believe the government should be able to collect my money and spend it on things I don't agree with. I'm not like that type of person really, but there have been people who've made moral arguments to the contrary, that taxes themselves are theft, and that the system of taxation is itself morally questionable. So, keeping in mind, and we'll talk about this in a moment, the difference between a legal and a moral obligation. But all that aside, I don't disagree. I do think that it is generally a moral obligation to pay taxes in a fair and just society. But it's possible for there to be arguments given against that claim too. Caring for your child. Now, I think that's a pretty good one there, Lisa. If you've taken custody of the child as your own, right? Because there are some people like surrogate mothers who carry the fetus, but then give it to the custody of the actual guardian. In other cases, people give their children up for adoption agencies and things. So I would say, all those cases aside, yes, caring for your child is not just something that's optional morally. It's a moral obligation that you have. Helping a dying relative or aging relative in their last couple of years. Again, probably fair there, Brian, with the exceptions noted that I've already mentioned in other cases before. And the only thing I would add to that is, even suppose that you do have a very loving and happy, supportive family, and this relative is one of those type of people. Some might argue that you don't have a strict moral obligation to provide care, only because it might stand in the way of your other interests, your free time, your professional or academic pathway or pursuits. I would seem to think that yes, there's an implied obligation there, but some people might say no. The people shouldn't expect others to care for them. They should care for themselves. So there's some kind of possibility for debate. But anyway, I'm always going to mention the wiggle room when there is any. Feeding your dog every day, Jacob? Yes, I would say so. You've made the dog depend on you anyway by choosing to have the dog. So if you didn't want to have the obligations of care, then you shouldn't have taken a dog in. But there are some people who think that our moral obligations to animals are not the same as those to human beings. And there's been some moral philosophers that argue our duties are strictly to man, other human beings anyway. I tend to disagree with that, but I'm just filling you in on all the complex landscape of moral arguments that can be made and that have been made. Rory, you say if a person falls down walking down the sidewalk, going to see if they're okay and calling emergency medical services. Yes, not just being the bystander that doesn't act. I would think in most cases that's a moral obligation, although it's not a legal obligation. And some people might say that you have no duty to assist, just a duty to do no harm. But again, that's debatable. Now, Eric, you say eating and drinking to survive, and I got to disagree with you there, because whether you survive or not is up to you. I mean, you could even commit suicide, and I think you're morally permitted to do that, even though some people might not agree with that. But, some people want to end their life. And is it a moral obligation to continue to survive? You might say it's a homeostasis, like survival obligation, but we're talking about morality, and maybe some people find themselves to be in, I don't know, terminal illness, unbearable pain, and they would rather have a physician-assisted suicide than to continue eating and drinking to survive to the bitter end. So it's just one other possibility there I'm mentioning. Obeying the rules of the road, sure. Not just illegal, but probably a moral obligation, because you have an obligation to not harm people. Let me say a few other things about this, okay, that I could add to it. So there's a logical relationship between the first and the third of these different types of action, between what's morally impermissible and what's morally obligatory. So since what's impermissible is wrong and it's not okay to do, you have a moral obligation to not do anything that's what? Can you finish that thought? You're obligated to not do anything that is morally what? So there's one of these types of actions that are wrong. You're not supposed to be doing them, which means sort of the converse of that is that you have an obligation to what? To not what? So look, it's morally impermissible to rape people. You've said that, right? So if that's impermissible, then likewise, you're morally obligated to not what? Just two ways to say the same thing. Something's impermissible means you're obligated to not do it. So if you're talking about morally impermissible actions, then you have an obligation to what about those things? To not do the morally impermissible things. Right, Rory. So one easy way to generate examples here would be to just say something that's morally impermissible, and then you have an obligation to not do that. So we said it's morally impermissible to murder, right? Therefore, you have a moral obligation to not murder people. Or if it's morally impermissible to rape, then you have a moral obligation to not commit rape. Now, on the other hand, the morally obligatory things are things that you must do. So not doing those would be wrong. So if you have a moral obligation to let's give a few examples that I can throw in the mix. So morally obligatory acts, keeping a promise. Okay, so keeping a promise is one easy enough example of a morally obligatory action because when you make a promise to do something, you therefore generate an obligation to follow through on whatever you promised. If you didn't want to be obligated to do the promised action, then you shouldn't have promised to do it, but rather said, maybe I'll do it. Once you make the promise, you're expected and you're morally obligated, if not legally, to follow through on the content of the promise. So it would be morally impermissible to what when it comes to promising? Can you tell me that little riddle? If promising and keeping so it would be morally impermissible to break a promise. Take the case of a very important promise, like the promise to remain faithful and so on. When you get married, you take those vows. So you stand there up before, I don't know, God, if you believe in it, and the, congregation and all the people that have assembled there and the state. And you swear and vow to love, honor, obey this person, till death do you part. So you've therefore at that point generated a moral obligation to abide by the content of the promise, and it would be therefore impermissible to do otherwise. Now, so it's also morally obligatory, as we said, not just to not break promises, but to not do any of the morally impermissible acts. So you're obligated to not lie, cheat, kill, steal, or whatever else could be classed in the impermissible realm. Now, I want to make a point here, and this is something that might have come into some of your guys' minds. There's an important difference between what's considered a moral obligation and a legal obligation. So we cannot actually confuse the concept of morally obligatory and morally impermissible with legally obligatory or illegal. They're not the same, and it's important to see why not. Okay, so morality and law, they're influenced by each other, but morality is prior to law. Morality is what the legislators use, their moral compass, to try and institute laws that they think are good for society. But of course, because legislators are just fallible human beings, it's possible, and it has happened in history, that sometimes laws have been placed into the books that are themselves immoral laws. So can anybody think of some type of practice or institution that was at least at some point in history legal, but even when it was legal, it's common sense to say that it was wrong. It was morally wrong even when it was legal. Okay, there you go. Yeah, Chase, slavery would be the case. That's one case. That's only one, but that's a clear one. The institution of slavery was it was a legal institution for a long time. So people could own slaves, trade slaves as property all the way up in our country, at least until, the outcome of the Civil War and the 14th Amendment. But slavery was not moral when it existed. Otherwise, what would the reason have been to change it? The reason it was abolished was because of the social and, general recognition that that's something that's wrong to do. So if we said that law and morality were the same, then we would have to say that the people who freed slaves were doing something wrong because they were breaking the law. Or that people, let's say, who gave safe harbor to Jewish citizens during Nazi Germany's reign of terror, like in the Anne Frank house, that those people were doing something wrong because the German authorities said that you're supposed to turn such people over. So when there's bad laws that are immoral, they can deviate from what's right and wrong. So sometimes there can be actions that are legal but wrong, like the case of slavery. And then there can be actions that are illegal but not wrong. That's possible too. I don't know if you can think of any examples like that, but I don't know. Some people argue for drug law reform in our country. So there have been some people who say that the war on drugs is a failure. It's resulted in mass incarceration, but people are still using drugs at the same rates. So somebody might argue, even on libertarian grounds, people might say, I'm free to do what I want with my own body, so don't tell me that I can't take these drugs. If I want to take risks with my health and my mind, then that's up to me and it's no one else's business. So that person might righteously stand up and say, even though the law says drug use is illegal, I believe that personal use of drugs is not morally wrong. Obviously, if there was no difference between law and morality, then there would be no way for us to ever engage in righteous civil disobedience, like protest against a law that you think is wrong. Kylie, you talk about segregation and restricting women's rights. Yes, other good examples of actions that were at least at some time legal, but in the full context of our historical hindsight and moral progress, we know that they were wrong. So again, guys, just making a point here. that we can't just easily shut off our brains and say, well, whenever the state says that it's wrong, that means, sorry, when they say it's illegal, that means it's wrong. And when the state says that it's legal, that means it's right. You still have to engage in original moral contemplation and reflection on the nature of the exact policy and whether you think it's right or wrong. Because like there are moral debates over abortion, right? Even though federally speaking, it's legal in all 50 states ever since the Roe versus Wade decision of 1974. Some people will say, oh, I don't think that abortion is moral, even though the law allows it. So we can't just settle all the moral questions by pointing to the law. And so I'll just end this discussion of law and morality with this. When you're studying ethics academically, like in philosophy classes of these kinds, you should think about morality, or rather, you should think of yourself instead of being the subject of law, like you're just a citizen and the laws apply to you, so you got to follow them. You should think of yourself as the legislator, he or she who actually votes on and implements the laws. So if you are, let's say, like a legislator and a bill comes before your desk and the bill is, shall we legalize recreational use of marijuana or not? You can't just say, well, what does the law tell me I have to do here? Because you're making the law, right? And you are therefore making a judgment about whether it would be good or bad in some more general sense for this law to be implemented in the society. So when we think of ethics, we have to think originally about the question of whether some conduct or policy is right or wrong. And we can't just defer to a court of higher authority because we even allow ourselves to make moral critiques of the laws themselves. Okay, so good discussion on that. So we've talked here now about morally impermissible acts, morally permissible acts, and morally obligatory acts. And when we make judgments about what status an action has, the term that we use for that is called moral reasoning, which is mentioned in the book. So now I'm going to put that in the chat as well. Moral reasoning, when you make a decision about what is right or wrong, or about what you should or should not do. Okay, that's moral reasoning. When you evaluate, judge, try to come to a conclusion about whether a particular action is right or wrong, or about whether you should or should not do something, morally speaking. And we all have our own moral judgments. Some people will look at, I don't know, a verdict given in a high-profile case, and they will say, I think justice was done, and I think it was right for that verdict to happen. And another person may say, no, in my interpretation of the facts, I say that was a bad, immoral outcome, whatever the verdict might have been. And in other cases as well, somebody might have done an action that some people praise and other people condemn. So you are a moral judge. You are capable of engaging in, and you do engage in judgment about what behaviors, conducts, actions, policies are right or wrong. Sometimes you're the subject of other people's moral judgment and even your own. We can sometimes look at our own conduct and feel mixed feelings about whether it's right or wrong. And sometimes we may be subject to the moral judgments of others, whether those are positive or negative. So moral reasoning is what that is, making those decisions about what's right or wrong and about what you should or shouldn't do. Now, next point. People as far back as the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and other ancient Greek philosophers, they said that being moral makes us happier. And there are also some studies that confirm that. So like but some people anyway seem to think that being moral is just kind of like a losing proposition because you're going to go out of your way to do the right thing, while other people who are less scrupulous and who have less of a moral code will just exploit your tendency to be fair and right, to gain an advantage over you, right? So some people will say you've got to cheat to win and you've got to be conniving and, kind of willing to do things that are not above board morally to get the kind of results that you want in life. But there's a lot of studies that show us, in fact, that commitment to some kind of moral framework or principles makes you happier and makes you more content at a deep level throughout your life. So there is some kind of built-in reward mechanisms for being on the moral side. And that's why I think most people choose that in general, even though we know there's always deviance. So next we're going to talk about what are the difference between moral and non-moral values. Two different types of values that mentioned in the book. So moral values. So moral values are values that benefit you and others, and they're considered good for their own sake. So okay, moral values. Values that are good for you and other people, and they're considered good for their own sake. So let me give you some examples now of what some of these moral values are. There are things like forgiveness, compassion, justice, altruism, just to give you a couple of things there. Values. Values are things that we care about that inspire and motivate us to act a certain kind of way. And if you hold these moral values, then the result of acting according to them is that it benefits you and it benefits other people. But also, even when it doesn't create that benefit, we still think it's good in its own right to have these values and to show them in your behavior. So, like for example, let's go with forgiveness. If you value forgiveness, then that's going to be a benefit to the person that you show forgiveness towards, because instead of holding a grudge, being resentful, not letting things go, you're willing to allow them back into your good graces. And so that's, of course, a benefit to the person who otherwise would have been shut off and never forgiven. And at the same time, it's a benefit to you as well, the one who does the forgiving, because if you don't forgive, then you have to carry with you that hostility and, kind of psychic tension that comes with feeling offended, hurt, holding on to your feelings of resentment. So walking around feeling the feeling of resentment, hostility, anger is not great for your own cognitive psychology. So to be forgiving type of person is a rewarding thing for you because it allows you to sort of lighten the load of the burden that comes from carrying those weighty negative feelings. And it also is, of course, a benefit to the person whom you forgive. Now, look, though, can it ever be the case that when you forgive somebody, they still stab you in the back again, and they don't return the favor by being kind or generous or fair? Is it possible for a person to forgive someone and they still get double crossed again? Can you answer that one? I think it's easy to say. Yes, certainly it can happen. I hope it hasn't happened too many times to you guys, but it can happen. When it does happen, though, does that make us say, hey, you know what, forget forgiveness? It's a bad thing, and this person, it was wrong for them to be forgiving? No. Even when it doesn't reach the intended goal of bringing everyone back into friendly and harmonious relations with each other, we still think that it's good on you to show the disposition to be a forgiving person, even if occasionally some people will not reward your act of forgiveness. So that's what it means when it says it's considered good for its own sake, even when it doesn't reach some kind of desired results. We still think it's good just for its own sake to be the kind of person who's willing to forgive. And the same with these others, right? Suppose that you're committed to the value of justice, meaning that you want to treat people fairly and in the way that they deserve and not otherwise. Well, if you're fair and just to people, then they're going to be benefited by the fair treatment that you give them instead of being mean-spirited, biased, or unfair. And at the same time, you benefit by being a fair and reasonable person, not just because other people respect you, but because you can kind of sleep better at night knowing that you're fair. At the same time, sometimes you'll be fair to others and they won't be fair back to you, and they'll kind of take advantage of your kindness or your fairness. Nonetheless, we don't think it's a bad thing, even when it does have that happen. So we got a few examples. Compassion, the ability to care about other people's feelings, take an interest in their pain and suffering. Other people will be benefited when you show compassion to them, but it also makes you feel better as a human being because you know that you're the sort of person who has genuine connections to people and that you're invested in them. So the moral values are good all around. They're beneficial to those who you display them towards, and they're also benefit for you and your own character internally because you're the kind of person who has them. And even in those few possible scenarios where they don't get to the results you had hoped, we still think they're valuable for their own sake. Okay, now to the next though, we want to discuss on the other side, what are non-moral values. So let's go over that really quick. So non-moral values, these are goal-oriented values, and they're only desired as a means to an end. Okay, so they're a little more self-serving. Okay. Non-moral values. So some of our values are not moral in nature. They're goal-oriented values. Sometimes they call these instrumental values. But what these are, for example, let me give some examples here in the chat then. So it's stuff like fame, popularity, prestige, wealth. All right. Fame, popularity, prestige, wealth. So suppose that you hold a value of wealth, right? So you care a lot about wealth. That's something very valuable to you. That's goal oriented because why do you want wealth? You want it for the sake of your own benefit, not necessarily for the benefit of other people. Um, and the reason that you want wealth is not for its own sake. It's not like you just want the money just so that you can like look at it or put it on the mantle and frame it like a piece of art. You want money if you want it, just because it's a means toward the purchase of goods and services that you think will make you happy. So you want it, but not for its own sake, but rather for the sake of what it can give you, which is happiness or pleasure. Um, if wealth didn't make you happy, then you wouldn't really want it, right? You reason you want it is because you think it will tend towards your happiness and satisfaction. Popularity, the same. You know, you might care about being popular and well liked by people or well perceived by people because it makes you happy or pleased to know that you have that popularity. Um, Same with fame, prestige, and so on. Now, these values, it's not that they're bad, but they're not necessarily always to the benefit of other people. And again, they're not considered valuable for their own sake. If becoming popular made you depressed, like some celebrities that commit suicide and stuff, become famous, popular, wealthy, but they're still not happy, then you might say, well, I guess it wasn't really that important that they achieve those things because they didn't make them happier or more satisfied in the end. So we care about these other non-moral values, but only insofar as they produce happiness for ourselves and not otherwise. Unlike the moral values, which are regarded as good unconditionally, even in the case where they don't, make anybody better off. Um, Now, what the book mentions, and I think it's a fair point, is that you have to have, if you want to have a fully realized and happy life, a healthy mix of both of these types of values. You have to also have some values in there that are based around benefit to others and not just merely yourself, because a purely self-serving and selfish life in the end feels a little hollow and disconnected from other people. um, so there's even studies which indicate that the non-moral values such as wealth do not produce ultimate happiness. And so if you want really to be happy and fundamentally balanced and well-rounded as a human being, then you should have a good mix of these moral values inspiring your behavior in life. Um, and in fact, there's also some evidence to indicate that when you're a better critical thinker, better at just reasoning over matters of truth and falsity, that sometimes can make you a better moral reasoner too, and better able to uh, evaluate all of the complex factors that go into a moral judgment. So, a couple of other pieces of terminology from the chapter 9 notes that I'm just going to continue developing with you. Sometimes we do things morally that we don't like. Sometimes we can regret our own behavior. And a lot of that comes because of the existence of what's known as the conscience. So let's now get into the word or concept of that. Um, so what is our conscience? It's a word maybe some of you've heard or used even. Not to be confused with consciousness. Those are two different concepts. Consciousness is just the ability to have a mind that thinks and perceives. So just the fact that you can hear my voice means you have consciousness. But conscience is a moral concept. Like sometimes people talk about having a guilty conscience, or sometimes people say I couldn't do that because it would weigh on my conscience. So the conscience in that sense is just some innate source of knowledge about what's right and wrong. Okay, conscience, you see there, an innate source of knowledge about what is right and wrong. Um, so innate, what that means is it's built into us, we're born with it. So it's not something that we acquire from an external source. It's something that's like just hardwired into human nature. And this conscience that we have, it indicates to us what the right and wrong actions are in life. So it helps us to guide our behavior in line with our moral principles. Um, Now, it's innate, as I say, but even though it is, it's something that can either be nurtured and therefore develop and grow, or it can be neglected. And in that case, it might wither away and become very weak. So a lot of importance comes to your early life moral education that you receive from your family and your community and from whatever other social influences that you have. They kind of help to shape and guide the formation of your conscience, but without that proper support it might not properly develop. Here's another example of something similar. So as human beings we all have an innate ability to learn language, like that's a human thing that we of course do have, as you can tell from our ability to write and speak. um, but even though that's an innate quality, like there's a language acquisition capacity of the human brain, it's not going to develop in the proper way if it's not activated by the right environmental inputs. So you might know that there have actually been a few children in history that have been like released into the wild as little babies and somehow raised by like a pack of wolves. This has actually happened, and they find this child later on, a feral child that they call them, and they've not learned language. In one case, this girl that was found in nature, not with any kind of cognitive disabilities or mental illness, but just didn't know language, and they were not able to really ever fully explain or teach her the concepts because it came on too late in life for her to acquire it in the natural way as a young infant and toddler. So anyway, the larger story here is that conscience is kind of like that. With the proper environmental support and nurturing, it can bloom. But if it's ignored, neglected, or not given the right kind of support, then it might not. Um, with the conscience we have, it has a kind of emotional element that motivates us to want to act in a certain way, to want to act in a way that we think is right, and to not act in a way we think is wrong. So sometimes your conscience will bother you if you've done something wrong, because it will tell you you feel guilty. Um, Now, I know that sometimes people don't like the feeling of guilt and they don't like having a guilty conscience, but that does not mean that you should just try to ignore it completely and turn it off and not listen to what your conscience is saying. It's there for a reason. It's trying to steer you towards the proper moral conduct. And so, effective moral reasoning means that you have to listen to your conscience and try and take measure of what it's telling you. Now, some people they suppress this because it's just uncomfortable. So once you have a guilty conscience, people say, "Oh, don't give me a guilt trip," or they'll do anything to distract themselves from the recognition of their own poor behavior. Um, but we only learn in life by trying to improve on the mistakes that we've made. And if we just ignore them or push them to the back of our mind, then we can't make those improvements. So, not to say that you should always be feeling guilt all the time, or that you should burden yourself with a heavy, you know, um, feeling of regret about all your moral decisions. But you should at least be willing to be in touch with the conscience that you have, and not try to just gain too much distance from it. Okay. Now, one of the things that the conscience reveals to us are these different moral sentiments that we have. Um, and so that's another term used in the book. Let me put that in here next. Moral sentiments. So, moral sentiments are emotions which alert us to moral situations and cause us to want to do what's right. So, let me write that here. Moral sentiments, emotions which alert us to moral situations and cause us to want to do what's right and not to do what's wrong. Um, so what are some of these different moral sentiments? One of them is compassion, and let's now give a more complete description of what that is. Compassion is um, compassion. It is the ability to understand and care about other people's pain and struggles. Um, so when you have compassion, you don't just sort of like view the fact that someone's suffering with indifference, like, oh yeah, they're suffering, that must be terrible. You actually care a little bit about it. You sort of, in a way, can feel what they feel, or you feel for them. So you're willing to be connected morally and emotionally to your fellow human beings. Compassion means that you just are willing to uh, think in terms of the other person's experience and to take some interest in it, which are sort of two different things. It's one thing to understand that somebody's suffering or going through a difficult situation, but it's something else to care about that. So if you're a compassionate individual, you're sympathetic, you're concerned about the well-being of others and about the harms they may go through or the struggles they may go through. Um, Another so-called moral sentiment that the book mentions is moral tragedy. So the way they put this one is when you make a bad moral decision that you later regret. So this is a bad feeling that comes from making a moral choice that you later regret. So that's kind of like the idea of having a guilty conscience. If it had been me editing this book, I might have just said that, but they want to use a slightly different piece of terminology or lingo there. So moral tragedy, that's a bad feeling that comes from making a moral choice that you later regret. None of us are, I think, 100%, angels or saints. We've probably all done at least a few things in life that we wish we could take back or we wish we hadn't done. And your conscience will reveal those feelings to you as a moral tragedy, or more simply, we call it guilt. Um, let's see here. There's also, um, sorry, pages here. Helper's high. Helper's high, here we go. So helper's high is a good when you help other people and then you feel good about yourself as a result. Okay, so another of the moral sentiments is the so-called helper's high. In a way, again, I'm not a huge fan of the terminology because it makes it seem like it's some kind of like intoxicating thing, like almost the use of drugs. But to be fair, there is in fact some psychological studies that indicate that when you're altruistic, compassionate, and helpful to other people in some general way, that actually results in a chemical release of like endorphins and so forth in the brain that makes you feel content and self-satisfied. So there's actually almost like a natural reward mechanism that's built into us that induces us to feel good when we're helpful to other people. Um, and that's kind of an interesting thing to note because human beings are supremely social. Like we really work collectively together. We're not just, hunters and gatherers out here looking out for just ourselves and our own family. If we were, then we never would have developed all these extraordinary systems that allow us to live and flourish together as a community. So like, technology, transportation, communication, you name it. These things only happen by humans working cooperatively together in collectives. So, of course, nature, evolution, whatever has provided us with some type of mechanism that induces us to do this well. And that's one of the main reasons that we've had the most success of any animal on this planet. So helper's high is part of that. Let's see. We can also talk about moral outrage. Okay. So moral outrage is when a person perceives something they take to be unjust and then they become upset because of that. So when you perceive an injustice and become upset. Okay, when you perceive an injustice and become upset, this is known as moral outrage. There's all kinds of incidents, events that can happen and that do happen that elicit outrage. Maybe it's, I don't know, a case of um, let's see, political malpractice. Maybe it is the outcome of a court case. Maybe it is a incident of police misconduct, or um, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of things that people do get mad about. We have a very angry society in a lot of ways, and that's okay though, because it's part of our moral sentiments revealing to us something that we think is wrong. Um, and when you feel moral outrage, it makes you want to do something to correct the situation in order to bring about justice. Um, Notice that moral outrage doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself have been treated badly or unfairly. It merely requires that there's the recognition of some type of unjust act or practice in society, and you're upset about it, whether it affects you or not. Now, a little bit more of a personal kind of moral outrage is what's known as resentment. So let me cover that with you. Resentment. Resentment is when you yourself are the victim of the unjust behavior, and then become upset. So, okay. So, let me give you an example to show the difference between these two concepts here. Um, Going back to, like, say, the civil rights era of the 60s and late 50s in the United States, one of the key events there was the bus boycott, of the Montgomery bus boycott, that was led by citizen and then civil rights activist Rosa Parks. And maybe some of you guys know, right, that we had segregation in the United States in a lot of different ways back then, and there was this kind of norm that existed on public busing systems that if there were um, white patrons that had joined the bus and there were no seats available at the front, but there were available seats at the back, the expectation socially was that black citizens should go to the back of the bus to make room for the white citizens to sit at the front. And in a way, I mean, it's pretty clearly to create a sort of second-class citizen status for black Americans, as though they don't have the same entitlement that everybody else has to just take a position on the bus, deferring to the white citizen as though they have a greater social standing. And so, that's harmful to the psyche of black people, and it's certainly unfair. And so, suppose that you're a white citizen, though, you're not affected negatively by the existence of these policies personally, but you're upset about it because you can recognize that it's not a fair system. That could be moral outrage. But if you are, let's say, a black citizen at that time, and you are one of the people like Rosa Parks, who is directly um, the recipient of unfair treatment in this scheme, then you're going to feel resentment, which is just a little bit more of a personal version of that moral outrage. Obviously, sometimes bad things that happen in society don't have a direct impact on our own life or our daily lives, but knowing that something's wrong doesn't require that you're the victim of the bad behavior necessarily. So, resentment versus injustice. Um, and so, as I've said before, some people respond to guilt with resistance, wanting to ignore or get even angry at people, like, don't give me a guilt trip. But understand that if you never felt any guilt at all about anything, that's not very good for you. Because what's the sort of person that can do anything at all and feel no guilt whatsoever? Can you tell me what kind of person is that? You do the worst things possible and they just don't care, feeling nothing the whole time. What kind of person is that? And do we want to be like that? Let me know. What would you call a person who could do all kinds of terrible things and feel no guilt? A psychopath, perhaps, sociopath, something along that kind of spectrum, yes. So we don't want to be the sort of person who could, like, literally, kill, torture, abuse people and be like, haha, I don't care, or if it's even funny. That's not a well-balanced or well-ordered psychology for anybody to have. So as much as guilt may be uncomfortable, the opposite extreme is even worse. You're feeling nothing really when you're doing bad things. You have to be in touch with some kind of moral compass, or else what are you even doing in life? There's been a lot of famous people out there. Well, I shouldn't call them famous, but there have been some well-known people serial killers and others that found no degree of guilt as they went out and committed the most atrocious acts. Now, I don't want to conflate the cases because I'm not saying everybody that's not given to great feelings of guilt is a psychopath, but um, there's some at least affinity between the two descriptions. So we should be mindful of that. And let's see. I want you to know the difference between guilt and shame. And so let me just quickly make a point about that because it's mentioned in the book. Guilt, a bad feeling that motivates us to correct a wrong. But shame, slightly different from guilt. And let me try to explain how and why. Shame is a bad feeling that results not from you having done a wrong, but rather from violating a social norm. Okay, so it's possible to feel shame without guilt. Let me see if anybody can figure out what kind of case that would be in. So if guilt is experienced when you have done something wrong, but shame is experienced when you've just violated a social norm, can anybody think of a type of, or just a general description of a situation where you'd feel shame but no guilt? It would be a case where you did something but not something else. So what can anybody say about that? Shame without guilt, based on these definitions, would be like what type of case? Farting in class. Okay, that's funny. Thanks, John. Yeah, so it's an example. What you're talking about is it's a violation of a social norm, like because you're supposed to try and control those things, I guess, while you're in class or in any kind of public place, really. But it's not like immoral per se, right? Because it's just a bodily function, and you could argue that you didn't do it intentionally, of course. And so, although it's embarrassing to you, and you sort of feel like a little bit singled out, maybe people laughing at you, you didn't think that you did something immoral. So you don't feel guilty, but you do feel ashamed. That's a great example. And others are of the same kind. The general feature that they would have in common is you did something that was like not considered like normal or expected, but it wasn't itself immoral behavior either. Suppose that you came to, I don't know, like a formal event dressed casually, and everyone's kind of looking at you like you're standing out wearing the wrong attire. You might be like, oh man, I'm really feeling ashamed here because I don't fit in. But it's not necessarily guilt, though, because it's not like a moral imperative to do this, rather just a social norm. So sometimes I guess people feel bad about their guilty feelings because they're confusing it with shame, like as if the person's just making you feel ashamed for something that's not in itself morally wrong. But knowing the difference between the two allows us to see how sometimes, um, even when guilt is not appropriate, shame is, or it can be felt. So yeah, and they mentioned in the book that if you go back in time enough, and even today, I guess in some cases, the social taboos against like people that are of same sex, gay, could have made them feel shame because they're alienated from the mainstream of society, since it's a minority orientation, obviously. But if you believe you've been born this way, or that you have no choice in the matter about how your desires develop in life, then you might say, well, I can't feel guilty about the identity that I have. But when society punishes people or socially ostracizes them, they could feel shame for the same reasons. So anyway, interesting to have that food for thought. Now, the next set of notes from chapter 9 talks about the development of moral reasoning in a person's life over time. But I want to leave it at that for the moment because I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves in the notes. There's still a lot to say, but I don't want it to finish too early. So that's why I'll probably close our class meeting right now and let you guys go. But let me know that everything's fine, and I'll just check with you here in our chat, and then I'll start to close the streams. So are we all right, everybody, on our first installment of ethics? Okay, thank you guys so much. I'll close these one by one, and again, I'll post the lecture, the YouTube version of the lecture later today to our Canvas page, and I'll be in touch through email if you need anything between now and Thursday, and I'll also post the link for the Thursday meeting as well in the same place we've done, where it's the announcements tab of our class. All right, guys, so have a great one, and I'll see you next time. Ending the Zoom feed for the moment. Okay, great. And all right, see you guys on YouTube. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll be with you soon. Okay, bye-bye.